we have had a huge, or should it be an huge, no, a huge amount thrown at us. The arguments for and against will be posed and will be explored endlessly. The point of today was to focus on the food element of it. When in the tortuous process, and rushed as ever with me, of organizing this conference, it seemed to me we needed to end the conference not with more detail, but actually, where is the public? This is a debate which is beyond the minutiae of policy wonks, cognoscenti, technocrats, managerialists, the food industry, science funders, you know, chaps and chapesses. This is about the great British public. And I asked Andrew, whom I've known many years, from the Henley Centre, Forecasting Days. Now he's director of the Futures Company, which still is. It's the evolution from that. Part of the giant company, WPP, the biggest advertising and marketing company in the world, said, Andrew, I phoned you up and said, would you come and outline where's the British public on this issue? The short answer is, we don't know. There is polling going on, not much of it, indeed almost none of it in the public arena, but nonetheless, in this last session, I want us to focus, or this was my idea, you can do what you like, but let's focus on the issue where this is going to actually be fought out, which is in the public. So, Andrew, you kick us off.
So thank you, Tim, for the invitation to speak here today. And actually, I'm going to start. Futures Company, what we do is we help people understand change, and we have quite a lot of those very large international food companies that we talked about in the last session amongst our clients. I haven't gone round and rung them. I'm fairly confident they've got almost 0 views so far on what this might mean outside of their kind of very special strategy functions. But where I wanted to start was actually with the question that Jeff touched on, because actually, as I started to think, well, why are we having a Brexit referendum now? You know, actually, that's quite a difficult question, you know. Greece, which God knows has suffered a lot more oppressively at the hands of the European Union. Even Greece is not talking about leaving the European Union. They may not be very fond of the euro. And it reminded me of a talk I went to by Peter Alter, the German historian. And he went back to 1953 and this meeting here with Adenauer and Churchill. So Churchill was Prime Minister for the second time. He was 78 at the time. And during the course of this meeting, and the reason I'm talking about 1953 here is that actually this issue goes into the deep history of the Conservative Party. Churchill drew this Venn diagram on a placemat, and the reason this is not the actual thing, this is my reconstruction from my notes of Peter Alter's talk, so I apologize for that. I thought you could find everything on the internet these days, but it turns out you can't find a photograph of the placemat which Adenauer kept. The reason we know about this is Adenauer kept it, and it was in his papers.
Does anyone know, did everyone know that was Adenauer? Yeah, who didn't?
Well.
See, that's the issue. Go back to that picture, Andrew. I know you well enough to interrupt. That is the crucial moment on which we are talking. And he's of a certain age that he assumed you knew that.
He was the German Chancellor.
He was the German Chancellor.
So anyway, so Churchill pulled out this placemat and started drawing on it. And then he kind of sketched in Britain like this. This was about the relationship that Britain was going to have with Europe. And, you know, Churchill was apparently quite good at maths at Harrow, though not very good at anything else. But he doesn't seem to remember it very much when he was 78, because not only was Britain in that shaded area, but then he said, and we're also in the middle here. So Britain is not only have these relationships, but we're also in the middle. We are the fulcrum between Britain, Europe, and the United States. And I think, you know, you have to remember that, you know, Churchill was born in 1874. He made his reputation in the Boer War.
Yeah.
His first post in government was as the Undersecretary for the Colonies in 1905. And before he became a national hero in Britain for the Second World War, he wrecked his reputation during most of the 1930s, fighting tooth and nail, alienating almost every other politician in the country against any kind of home rule for India. So what's actually in that Venn diagram is a profoundly imperial view of Britain's relationship with Europe and Britain's relationship with the rest of the world. And so I'm grateful to Jeff for having warmed the conversation up in that respect. So the first proposition I have for you is that actually what this referendum is about is actually an attempt to finally resolve this kind of deep issue at the heart of the Conservative Party. If any other party was in power at the moment, we would not be having a referendum. The second thing to say is that actually this is probably the last moment at which actually this is a live political issue. I haven't put there's quite a lot of data up there about attitudes to Europe, but I think the important thing to say, it's pretty obvious the important thing to say, this is by age. If you're 18 to 34, you kind of don't really know what the fuss is about. If you're 55 plus, you're still a bit worried about it. 35 to 54, they're already leaning towards remaining against leaving. This data is from May. It's the British Election Study Panel. John Curtis has helpfully pulled together a lot of different bits of data. These numbers are in about the middle of the kind of spread. I could show other numbers. They strongly skew by education, the key date being whether you stayed on an education after 16 or not. But obviously with the expansion in both 18-year-old education and university education, it's sometimes hard to tell what bit of that skew is about education and what skew is about age. They skew less strongly by class. They skew a little bit by gender. Men are more likely to want to leave than women. And that's kind of about it. Those are the sort of the main splits. But I think the strongest split is around age. And of course, the hazard, the possible unintended consequence here is that obviously those 55 pluses are much more likely to vote than those 18 to 34s and those 35 to 54s. So that's kind of all I'm going to say on polling data, because actually it's not always that helpful. So what I'm going to do and move on now is just talk to attitudes to food and retailing, which has changed quite a lot since the crisis, although some of these changes you could actually see before the financial crisis. I'm drawing here on work that the Futures Company did in this report, which is available, Future Shoppers, a couple of years old, which we wrote with Kantar Retail. And we identified these four shifts, which I think are relevant to the discussion today: beyond loyalty, beyond experience, beyond value, and beyond convenience. First one is beyond loyalty. It's about trust and assurance. I was worried that the horse meat saga wouldn't still be a live issue, but I'm reassured to discover from listening today that it still is. One of the things that we've seen a lot of in that, especially since the crisis, but actually before, is this decline basically in trust in brands. You can depend on brands that have been around a long time to produce good quality products. This is actually not just UK data, it's actually Europe Big Five data, but actually the UK is pretty much exactly in the middle of Europe Big Five here. And we've seen a strong decline there. I could have put up the data which says if a business thinks it will get away with something, it will try to do so, which shows a climb which is as sharp as that fall is sharp there. And I think one of the things that's interesting about that to me is that actually we've had quite a lot today about trust and safety and food reputation. And I think one of the unexpected things I think we might see in terms of some of the stories that have been told about Brexit so far is that actually you start seeing some of those crises which are around trust and assurance, but simply because the regimes, the inspection regimes and all the rest of it, are more uncertain than they were. And what I know from having done quite a lot of work in the area of water and water quality over the years is that actually those things create sort of political waves which are actually quite unpredictable and also very powerful when they come. So that's the first one of these, sort of beyond loyalty to assurance. The second one is about experience. This is actually, I'm not sure, I could ask you to guess which supermarket chain runs this store. It's actually Spar in Hackney. I'm not sure anybody would have guessed that if they hadn't been there. So the whole idea of experience as part of food is increasingly important, and it's also increasingly important financially. So, of that sort of food spend we have, sort of close to £200 billion a year, almost half, 2/5 of it actually goes on catering services. That's not just people spending in their pocket, obviously. It's obviously lunches and prisons and hospitals and all that as well. But it's almost as large as the amount we actually go out and buy in terms of food and drink. And at one level, part of that kind of experience in that catering service is one of the trends we've seen since the financial crisis is what we call little luxuries. People can't necessarily afford to splash out in the way they did before, but they can still mostly, and I'm aware of food banks and food poverty and its increase, but they can still generally find the fibre it will take to have a sort of a decent cup of coffee and a nice piece of cake in a cafe. And one of the reasons that cafes are still booming is kind of they benefited from that. But the other part of food experience is just a much greater awareness and interest, especially amongst younger people, of food as well-being, food as mood, food as fitness, food as health. And I've just put a generic picture of Brazil nuts. I think I took it from Wikipedia up there, just as a sort of placeholder for that whole kind of very strong trend about what food is doing. Food is a sort of something to manage your health and well-being. The third trend here is around reframing value. And I think there's probably two things to say about that. The first is that although the government has pointed out that per capita incomes have now risen above the level of the crisis, after 7 years, I'm not sure I'd be boasting about that, but they have. Actually, that's not true of people in work. The only reason that per capita incomes have risen above the average of 2007 is because of the triple lock on pensions. So people in work are still actually suffering from incomes which are below the level of 2007. And what that actually means is that you end up with this market that's quite interesting. You've got a market that really values quality food, but also values value as well, if you see what I mean. And I'm going to come back to this because if you want to look at the reason why Aldi is succeeding and Waitrose is succeeding to some extent and Tesco is not, it's because actually this point about the value of food and the way people understand it, Aldi and Waitrose get it and Tesco doesn't. Tesco still thinks it's all about price. So this picture actually comes from a food blog in Abergavenny. It is a spread bought for next to nothing. I think less than a tenner in Lidl in Abergavenny. But it's a sense of actually what people do about value. They will pay a bit more for stuff which feels special, and they will pay as little as they can for stuff which is dull. Baked beans, for example, people will buy those on private label because actually nobody really cares about the quality of baked beans. And despite Heinz's attempts over 40 years to make us care about the quality of baked beans, nobody really cares. But they do care about a decent Serrano ham or a decent spread of cheese or some nice olives. And it's just worth looking. This is just government data actually from here. I think I just noticed a typo, in fact. That should say quality or performance at the top there. But, so this is a ranking. Quality of performance is one of a list of about 10 attributes that you look at in your food. 18% have quality of performance as their top characteristic. 13% have taste or smell as their top characteristic. 30% have it in the top two on quality of performance. Just over 25% have taste or smell as their top characteristic when they're looking for food, when they're considering to buy food. So what we see is this kind of emergence, God knows at long last, of a sort of a proper food culture in the UK. So we end up with a much more complicated view that consumers have about value. And the final thought here is around time and headspace. And I'm sorry about that terrible Californian word. We've been trying to find something that's a bit more British, and we have failed dismally. But the story in this chart is that During the 1990s, the Henley Centre, which I joined before it became the Futures Company, actually invented the idea of time-poor, money-rich and time-poor consumers. That was obviously probably more true in the 1990s than it is now. And in the 1990s, people worried about time, and they kind of did all sorts of time-saving skills. During the 2000s, that moved into being strategies which are about managing energy. But what we've actually seen during the last 5 years is this idea that actually people are quite concerned about managing complexity. And I'm not going to tell a story about food here, but actually going to tell a story about Obama and his suits. You may know this, a very interesting profile of Obama written by Michael Lewis. And he asked him why all of the suits in his cupboard were either blue or grey. And this was the answer he got. You need to focus your decision-making energy. You need to routinize yourself. You can't be going through the day distracted by trivia. And actually, okay, that's the President of the United States. He's kind of obviously clearly quite a busy guy, has to make quite a lot of decisions. But actually, it's true of all of us. Actually, everybody generally is moving to a point where actually they've understood that decision-making is a cognitive load, and actually and a lot of decisions are too trivial to be worrying about. So actually, in terms of the food market, this kind of extends to things like, at the top end of the market, the food box. You know it's going to be decent quality, you know it's going to be a selection of fruit, you know it's going to arrive every week, every fortnight. But it's also sort of in other parts of the market, it's about just sort of not worrying about the brands. In Mercadona in Spain, probably the most aggressive exponent of this reimagining convenience. In categories where they know that consumers don't care, they stock 3 things. They stock the #1 brand in the category, the #2 brand, and their own brand, and that's it. So consumers know that they don't really have to ask questions of themselves. They don't have to spend a lot of time worrying about stuff that they don't really care about. Now, those are the kind of 4 themes. I'm going to try and bring them back to Brexit, although I think they're a bit loose, to be honest, in terms of Brexit. I'm going to try and bring them back before I finish. But I think it's also just, we've had a lot of this data sort of floating around, but I'm just going to put it on one page here. The UK food production sector, this is not including the agricultural sector, this is actually processing and production. It employs 3.4 million people, 12% of UK employment, by far the largest manufacturing sector in the UK. Only 7% by value, however, because generally it's a low-paid sector. We've already talked about this at all, but this is where our food comes from. A quarter from the EU, a bit less than 20% from the rest of the world. And this is this fast export gap, which I think Tim mentioned certainly in the notes, and I think he also mentioned it this morning, £21 million export gap. In fact, the only sector we have which actually exports more than imports is beverages, and the secret of that line is Scottish whisky, or Scotch whisky, possibly more accurately. So, quite a big sort of, if you're worrying about markets which you're going to have to renegotiate your export agreements kind of line by line, you've got quite a lot to worry about on that slide. I'm not going to talk about this stuff because it's already been covered a lot of times, but we've talked about Norway, Switzerland, and Turkey a lot. But I'm just going to pause on the last one there because, and I've deliberately put the naval red ensign on that thing rather than a British national flag, because I've actually seen the go it alone option described in one of the kind of the pro leaving pieces as open seas or something like that. And I have to say that, going back to Churchill and Adenauer, this kind of World Trade Organization, we'll just sort it out, bilateral agreements, feels to me like a kind of a late imperial fantasy of the kind of days when Britain ruled the waves and our Navy could sort out bilateral agreements to our benefit. So just sort of coming to a conclusion now, I'm kind of with the speakers who said that they don't really think that food is going to be a critical issue in the exit referendum, but I do think that it might have a role in a different way. And the role I think it might have in a different way, this is a piece of British fusion food, so a nice bit of red meat in the middle, surrounded by, I think, there's a bit of choy pak or something like that. I'm not, and a little bit of kind of Indian crackers on or maybe prawn crackers on the top, difficult to tell. But actually, going back to that sense that British food culture has been transformed, it's been transformed because people, especially younger people, are much more open to diverse cultures than British people used to be. And I do think that actually that sense of food and what it says about us as a culture and what it says about us as an open society, and that idea of what Europe is about for Britain might have a part to play in an exit referendum. Thank you very much indeed.